The floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador Cabañas and his staff, for an invitation to come to this important event. Maybe 2 of the last 64 years, our 2 governments have had effective dialogue, but I think that we have surpassed that by many years and many decades, and that it's been a source of comfort to us to know that experts are watching and looking for opportunities, and at least trying to find ways to educate our governments, or I'll speak on behalf of us, our government on ways that they can move forward with the policy. But thank you very much for inviting me. This is important, and it's also been a source of optimism for years. It was in this room that we all learned about normalization when Presidents Raúl Castro and Barack Obama had made their historic announcement, and maybe there'll be a historic announcement today. I stuck to the theme rather rigidly of the historic evolution of cooperation, official and unofficial cooperation, because last year, not knowing or forgetting that the camera was on, I said, "Look, I'll say something off the record for just in this room," and it was being broadcast. But this year I will do it a little bit more formally, not with a whole lot of detail and new information, and not a whole lot of new analysis, but just to lay down the record for future discussions. And my paper, Bill Leogrande's paper, has already been given to Ambassador Cabañas' staff, so you can read a little bit more detail. I think looking back at the last, the last 2.5 years, 2 3/4 years, one of the things that has surprised many of us who've worked in Washington for the United States government in a variety of capacities was how easy it was for President Trump to reverse all of the years of progress, not just the progress made during Obama, but the progress made during previous administrations in which I myself had also worked. I became a little bit more cynical, a little bit sad, and a little bit more cynical because having been in the bureaucracy for many years, I know that when a president tries to change course, usually our job as government employees is to resist a little bit and make sure that they know what they're doing and what they're throwing away when they do it. And the problem that we had with the Trump administration, in my personal opinion, is that the reversal of the historic normalization process launched by our 2 presidents, the reversal went a little bit too smoothly. There was no resistance. Our bureaucrats were in many cases, very happy to go back to the previous status of our relationship, in which they had built their careers, they were running programs, and also they could get a few voices, and it's only a few voices on Capitol Hill, could get them off their backs and then live more tranquil lives. And basically, their programs and their careers were safe. The Trump administration's maximum pressure approach, about which the Vice Minister spoke eloquently and accurately, I didn't hear anything inaccurate in that presentation, and analytically sound, has also proven attractive to the Biden administration. And that's the real sad thing for a lot of us. I worked for President Biden when he was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, but for only a short period of time. But I talked with his staff, I lived with his staff for 3 years after that. And I'm really quite surprised the way that he has not demanded of his staff new ideas, new proposals, new approaches. And so I'm a little bit concerned about it, that they have, even though Biden's former boss declared, and Biden seemed to have agreed, and certainly Dr. Jill Biden 100% agreed, that it makes no sense, when Barack Obama said it, it makes no sense to impose policies that will render a country a failed state, and that those attempts were counterproductive. But Biden has kept all but a few, as the Vice Minister said, all but a few relatively minor measures in place, and he's actually begun implementation of very difficult measures, such as the limitations on ESTA violations for visa waiver countries coming to the United States, knowing full well, actually with the purpose of harming Cuban tourism industry so that it couldn't rebound from the COVID hiatus in business. That's really very difficult. The other thing, as U.S. sanctions drive the Cuban economy into the ground and drive Cubans to emigrate, And emigration, I think, is the only national interest that the Biden administration sees in our Cuba relationship. While they're doing that, they're holding firm to Trump policies. And they're doing something that's even a little bit cruel, although I don't think it's intentional, I think it's incompetence rather than malice, is they're pre-briefing measures, they're backgrounding measures to a lot of people, and then they don't do them, which means you get people to have expectations that would be frustrated, increasing the sense of hopelessness. Nonetheless, not to contradict the Vice Minister's eloquent statement, I'll try to identify some positive aspects in areas of cooperation in the bilateral relationship that have endured, albeit on a very limited basis. And those are our people-to-people relations, I said on a limited basis, our migration, and some security matters. The Clinton administration, in which I worked, so I tend to defend and know why we did things, after the disaster of the shoot down in the Helms-Burton mess and stuff, the Clinton administration launched the idea that since the two governments couldn't get along, let's let the people do it. In other words, let's move cooperation from government to government, which was dysfunctional, move it to the people. And there was an interesting approach that worked. And so U.S. policy became that Americans, or U.S. persons and Cubans who have shared affinities based on faith or the arts or culture or humanitarian projects and stuff, let them work things out among themselves and get government out of the way. It wasn't about making regime change. It was rather just being good neighbors where we could and try to get a little momentum going. The policy came very late in the Clinton term. You might see the pattern among our presidents that in year 6, they decide to do relatively good things. But in 1998 and 1999, the Clinton administration did something with a pretty sound analytical foundation. Clinton believed that we should focus on our national interests, not just our political interests. And he challenged the U.S. government, challenged our bureaucracy, challenged me, to say that we can make such strong national interest arguments that the political interest will become smaller and more manageable. So focus on national interests, not political. Focus on people, not just the grudge match between two governments that had never been resolved. And focus on the future, not just on avenging the past. And in my opinion, that worked. That worked quite well. Today, under the Trump-Biden policies, or Biden-Trump if we do it in alphabetical order, Trump-Biden policies, U.S. persons traveling under people-to-people do so, but with major limitations, and limitations that frankly are a little bit offensive to many people, that you can come only if it's in support of certain U.S. government policy priorities. But it can come. It's far from what Bill Clinton envisioned. It's, of course, massively far from what Barack Obama wanted to do. But we can say that there is at least a little window of people so we can say that the prohibition is not total. Another area in which at least a little cooperation continues is migration. We all know that the Biden administration finally resumed, after the Trump administration's suspension, finally resumed the migration talks last year, even if the Biden administration put up relatively junior officials who didn't really know a lot of the history of the relationship up to deal with senior Cuban officials who knew everything about the relationship and sometimes even had to guide the Americans on historical facts on what was going on. But at least the meetings were happening. Meetings were happening, but the paradigm was different from other migration issues. In Central America, we said root causes. Let's deal with the root causes. In Cuba, we don't deal with the root causes because we're one of those root causes. Our embargo is intended to increase pressure on the Cuban government by putting pressure on the Cuban people. That's pretty well it. So we have a little bit of discrepancy there. But as I said, we'll find the silver lining that we are having talks, that we are putting people in our embassies down here, some little problems, and that miraculously the so-called sonic attacks scandal is gone. I don't know what happened to the sonic attacks, if they ever existed, but the U.S. government is seeming to try to pretend that it never made those allegations. But at least that's better than nothing. Cooperation in certain security areas has taken place in certain contexts, so certain, limited in certain, since at least the 1980s, and this is something that many people, even on the American side, don't know about. Even before, during, and after the Caso Número Uno here in Cuba, we on occasion shared intelligence information. We called them tippers. They were sanitized intelligence information, both ways, about narcotics passing into or near each other's waters or airspace. It was against the backdrop of a very successful negotiation on Angola, where the two countries had proven that if you put smart professionals at a table, that their mutual interests can actually be served through a mature negotiation. So there was sort of optimism that we could build on these sorts of tippers and these positive sentiments, because we had shown that we can set the rhetoric aside. I cannot quantify, because I don't know, the number of narcotics interdictions and arrests that the tippers led to. But the communication obviously had a value beyond law enforcement alone. It certainly did. It was valuable enough that President Clinton formalized and expanded, expanded it in 1998 and 99. He ordered the posting of a U.S. Coast Guard officer here at the U.S. Interest Section to build on the evolving, mutually beneficial cooperation between professionals at the U.S. Coast Guard District 7 and the Tropa Guardia Fronteras here in Havana. And it worked. I can't quantify, but it worked. Clinton's position, again, was that the national interest, dealing with the flows of migrants and narcotics, superseded the short-term political grumbling from certain people that the U.S. government had empowered in certain geographic parts of the United States. Sharing information on terrorist threats has also been an area where, at least during my time, both down here and at the National Security Council and the State Department, where it was above politics and rhetoric. In fact, during the Clinton administration, even people that were sort of hard on Cuba said, we do not play with terrorism and we inform. And so both sides, we exchanged tippers. I think we provided more tippers because often there were people of American origin more involved in plans that needed to be informed. But we provided tippers to the Cuban government, and it worked as well. I believe, and maybe someone here could corroborate, that sort of bewildered the Cuban officials because the United States, and you know this better than I, failed to prevent terrorist attacks against Cuba in the past and failed to prosecute for terrorist attacks in the past, and actually, as is now universally known because of documents released by the Church Committee and others, and stuff, actually conducted terrorist attacks against Cuba. But the Cuban government, and also there's an important thing, even during the Clinton administration, the U.S. government failed to take action on a terrorist attack, and that was the hotel bombings here in Havana, where there was good information that reached from very secure, trusted channels that identified who in the United States was providing funds and talking directly with the bombers in Guatemala and El Salvador. And FBI said, oh, we can't follow up, those numbers have been disconnected. End of investigation. So I think it's actually worth noting, and that was the Posada Carriles case, who later faced a minor immigration charge for his activities, a minor one. But I think that these are all examples that despite this record of non-compliance with U.S. law and international norms, Cuba accepted our tippers on terrorism with professionalism. During Bush-Cheney, things changed a little bit. There was a senior official at the White House who claimed that Cuban government was, quote, impeding our efforts to defeat terrorism by feeding the United States government misleading information. He said, this is not harmless game playing, it is a dangerous and unjustifiable action. He claimed, like, zero. went from 5 to 0?
No, 3 to 0.
That was 3.
Come on, take a minute, take a minute.
Okay, I'm almost done. I'm sorry. It was basically saying that the U.S. that Cuba was actively thwarting U.S. counterterrorism operations. Okay, it failed. He claimed, by the way, that the intelligence community supported his assessment. I was National Intelligence Officer for Latin America, and I can tell you we did not support it. It was never requested, and none of the 15 agencies in our intelligence community at the time would have agreed with that there was evidence that there was systematic stuff. Now, countries do play spy games. All countries play spy games, and there's cat and mouse and false angles, but this allegation was false and politically motivated. I don't know, factually, how much that really affected passing real-time terrorist tippers between the two countries. But I would say it was very harmful and showed a lack of disposition. I don't have factual knowledge of the trends in the Biden administration, but I think it's probably safe to say that an administration that is keeping Cuba on the so-called terrorist list, and an administration that is repeatedly saying that Cuba is, quote, not fully cooperating on counterterrorism, has probably not taken advantage of the opportunities to dialogue on these important security issues. They won't say, and it's not for me to ask you to do it. Bottom line, I'm finishing. The bottom line is that we have demonstrated, certainly during the last 3 decades, we have demonstrated repeatedly that the two countries, looking at this official and unofficial cooperation on security matters, the two countries have had important, sensitive, and responsible cooperation in the past. And Americans should understand, the American government should understand that the sky did not fall in. Nothing happened. In fact, the constituencies that most of our bureaucrats are most afraid of have not reacted negatively to most of those things. We have realized that actions in support of our national interests, rather than our political interests, are okay, even if they coincide with the interests of the other, if they coincide with the interests of Cuba. But we have not done nearly enough. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Fulton. Entonces vamos a dar la palabra a Elier, que además de ser una figura conocida públicamente en Cuba y ser subdirector, no, todavía era subdirector del Centro de Estudios Fidel Castro, además de todo fue compañero mío de aula en la universidad, lo cual no es que importe mucho, pero
no da más minutos por eso.
No te da más minutos por eso. Adelante.
Sorry.
Bueno, buenos días a todos. Realmente agradecer, ¿no?, la posibilidad de poder compartir en este evento, en este panel en específico, al CIPI, a Elier, a Mirrey, y bueno, todos los colegas que están acá. Yo creo que es inevitable no hacer análisis que vinculen el pasado y el presente. Y bueno, cuando pensábamos en qué propuesta traer a este panel, nos parecía que era oportuno no olvidar que estamos haciendo también este evento a 60 años de la primera iniciativa de acercamiento secreto entre Cuba y los Estados Unidos, que fue precisamente en el periodo de la Administración Kennedy, es decir, después de la ruptura de las relaciones diplomáticas, una iniciativa que se desarrolló por muy breve tiempo, de septiembre de 1963, que ya fue aprobada oficialmente por Kennedy, hasta su asesinato el 22 de noviembre del propio año. Creo que es importante la historia, no solo por las lecciones que nos brinda para el presente, sino, como bien dice nuestro colega Peter Comblo, utilizar la historia en cierta medida para ayudar a mover el presente. Y esa es también la intención, ¿no?, de esta ponencia. Luego del fracaso de la invasión estadounidense por Playa Girón y de la terrible experiencia de la crisis de octubre de 1962, John F. Kennedy, al parecer convencido de que no era inteligente en ese momento intentar cambiar el régimen cubano por la vía militar directa, comenzó a valorar un extenso espectro de tácticas donde quedaran por igual satisfechos los intereses estratégicos de Estados Unidos. Entre el amplio abanico de opciones que se discutían como posibles cursos de acción, el presidente estadounidense aceptó explorar de manera cautelosa y discreta un posible modus vivendi con la isla. Al mismo tiempo, la decisión de la URSS de retirar los cohetes sin contar con los cubanos y el disgusto de la dirección de la isla con tal actitud parecían mostrarle a Kennedy una brecha entre cubanos y soviéticos que valía la pena aprovechar. También un posible arreglo con Cuba sintonizaba muy bien con las intenciones de Kennedy de avanzar en un proceso de distensión con la URSS en esos momentos. Las negociaciones para el regreso a Estados Unidos de 1.200 mercenarios encarcelados en Cuba después de la invasión de Girón habían abierto el primer canal de comunicación entre ambos países desde el rompimiento de las relaciones diplomáticas. James Donovan, abogado de Nueva York, encargado de negociar la liberación de los prisioneros de Bahía de Cochino, como asesor legal del Comité de Familiares, se convirtió en el primer transmisor a Washington de la disposición de Fidel, con el que se reunió en varias oportunidades de resolver el conflicto bilateral. Kennedy reaccionó con interés ante todos los informes de las conversaciones Donovan-Fidel. Incluso, en marzo de 1963, ante la propuesta de uno de sus colaboradores de trasladarle a Fidel por intermedio de Donovan el mensaje de que solo dos cosas eran no negociables: los lazos de Cuba con el bloque chino-soviético y su interferencia en el hemisferio, asombrosamente el presidente estadounidense indicó que no estaba de acuerdo en convertir esta exigencia de rompimiento de los lazos chinos-soviéticos un punto no negociable. No queremos presentarnos ante Castro con una condición que obviamente él no puede cumplir. Debemos comenzar pensando en líneas más flexibles, expresó Kennedy. El 11 de abril de 1963, Gordon Chase, asistente de McGovern Bundy, asesor de seguridad nacional, había señalado en un memorándum enviado a este último que todos estaban preocupados por solucionar el problema cubano, pero que hasta ese momento solo habían tratado de resolverlo a través de maldades abiertas y encubiertas de diversa magnitud, obviando la otra cara de la moneda, atraer suavemente a Castro hacia nosotros. Chase expuso a Bundy sus consideraciones de que si la dulce aproximación a Cuba tenía resultados, los beneficios para Estados Unidos serían sustanciales. Probablemente, sostenía Chase, pudiéramos neutralizar a corto plazo por lo menos dos de nuestras principales preocupaciones en relación con Castro: la reintroducción de los misiles ofensivos y la subversión cubana. A largo plazo, podríamos trabajar en la eliminación de Castro a nuestra conveniencia y desde una posición de ventaja. De esta manera, hacia abril de 1963, la administración Kennedy analizaba todas las variantes que pudieran resolver el problema cubano, lo cual se convirtió prácticamente en una obsesión del presidente hasta el fatídico 22 de noviembre de 1963. Junto con las propuestas de acciones de la clásica agresividad en los documentos secretos del Consejo de Seguridad Nacional en Estados Unidos, se incluía la posibilidad de un desarrollo gradual de cierta forma de arreglo con Castro. El 30 de abril de 1963, en una reunión del grupo permanente creado para analizar propuestas de política hacia Cuba, se acordó mantener la línea de comunicación con Castro que había abierto el señor Donovan durante las negociaciones de los prisioneros norteamericanos. Pero para esa fecha se abriría otro importante canal de comunicación entre ambos gobiernos a través de la periodista Lisa Howard. La bella reportera había sido presentada a Fidel por Donovan en el transcurso del propio mes de abril, quien además le había gestionado una entrevista con el líder cubano. La entrevista, de 1 hora de duración, sería transmitida en Estados Unidos el 10 de mayo de 1963 y generaría titulares como «Castro quiere hablar con Kennedy» y «Castro da indicios de que quiere negociar con Kennedy». A su regreso a Estados Unidos, Lisa Howard informó a la CIA el interés del líder de la Revolución Cubana de conversar con la administración Kennedy. No fue hasta el 6 de junio del 63 que el grupo permanente evaluó con amplitud el tema de las conversaciones de James Donovan con Fidel Castro y los demás informes de inteligencia que señalaban el interés de Cuba en mejorar sus relaciones con Estados Unidos. En dicha reunión se valoraron las distintas vías para establecer canales de comunicación con el líder de la revolución y el grupo coincidió en que este era un esfuerzo útil. Mas habría que esperar al mes de septiembre para que comenzaran a materializarse los contactos y en ello desempeñaría un papel catalizador Lisa Howard. En septiembre de 1963, Howard contó con el apoyo de William Atwood, funcionario de la Administración Kennedy adscrito a la misión de Estados Unidos en las Naciones Unidas, motivado también con las posibilidades de establecer puentes con Cuba. Ambas personalidades se unirían en el esfuerzo de echar a andar un plan para iniciar conversaciones secretas entre Estados Unidos y Cuba. Un memorando elaborado por el propio Atwood y entregado al entonces embajador de Estados Unidos ante la ONU, Stevenson, desempeñó un rol importante en la decisión del gobierno estadounidense de utilizar la diplomacia secreta con Cuba. Este memorando, escribió Atwood, propone un curso de acción que, de alcanzar resultados positivos, podría eliminar el tema de Cuba de la campaña presidencial estadounidense de 1964. No propone ofrecer un trato a Castro, lo que desde un punto de vista político sería más peligroso que no hacer nada, pero sí una investigación discreta sobre la posibilidad de neutralizar a Cuba según nuestros propios intereses. Ya que no pretendemos derribar al régimen de Castro por la fuerza militar, hay algo que podamos hacer para promover los intereses estadounidenses sin que se nos acuse de contemporizar. Por el momento, lo único que desearía es autoridad para hacer contacto con Carlos Lechuga, el jefe de la misión de Cuba en las Naciones Unidas. Veremos entonces qué ocurre. Contando con la aprobación de Kennedy, se produciría entonces el primer contacto entre Atwood y el embajador cubano en Naciones Unidas, Carlos Lechuga. El encuentro se produjo en la casa de la periodista Lisa Howard en la noche del 23 de septiembre, de manera bastante informal y sin que pareciese un acercamiento oficial de Estados Unidos, como lo había pedido el propio Atwood, aprovechando una fiesta que la misma preparó y a la cual invitó a Lechuga. De inmediato, el embajador cubano informó a La Habana. Esto es un documento desclasificado desde Cuba. Dice Lechuga: tuve la entrevista con William Atwood. Me dijo que había sido autorizado por Stevenson. Se va hoy para Washington a hablar con Kennedy y pedirle autorización para ir a Cuba a hablar con Fidel y explorar las posibilidades de negociaciones si aceptan en Cuba que él dé el viaje. Quedamos en que yo no planeaba el asunto formalmente a ustedes hasta que él no tuviera la autorización de Washington, pero es obvio que él sabe que yo lo comunicaría inmediatamente. Ese fue mi planteamiento para que en todo momento la iniciativa partiera de ellos, como es en realidad. Pero en este negocio diplomático uno aprende mucho. Su viaje sería de incógnito. Al igual que yo, en todo momento aclaramos que estábamos hablando de modo personal, pendiente de las instrucciones de ambos gobiernos. Su idea es que la situación entre los dos países es anormal y que alguien en un momento dado tenía que romper el hielo. Al primer contacto de Atwood y Lechuga siguieron otros en el Salón de Delegados de las Naciones Unidas, así como comunicaciones telefónicas entre el propio Atwood y el ayudante personal del comandante Fidel, René Vallejo. El 31 de octubre, en una llamada que Vallejo realizó a Lisa Howard, este trasladó el mensaje de que Fidel estaba dispuesto a enviar un avión a México a recoger a un enviado de Washington y conducirlo a un aeropuerto secreto cerca de Varadero, donde tendría una reunión a solas con el líder de la Revolución Cubana. Lisa Howard respondió que dudaba que eso fuera posible y que quizás lo mejor era que él, Vallejo, como vocero personal de Fidel, viajara a Naciones Unidas o a México a reunirse con un representante del gobierno de Estados Unidos. Después de varias propuestas desechadas de que Atwood u otro funcionario estadounidense viajara a Cuba o a México para una reunión secreta, o que Vallejo viajara a Nueva York, se le envió a Lechuga por parte de la dirección cubana una propuesta de agenda con vistas a una posterior reunión de Fidel con algún emisario de Washington. El 22 de noviembre se produjo el asesinato de Kennedy en Dallas. Coincidentemente, el mismo día que el periodista francés Jean Daniel, bajo el encargo personal de Kennedy, conversaba con Fidel y le trasladaba un mensaje conciliador, un mensaje que Fidel después relató que interpretó como un mensaje de paz. Si bien es cierto que Kennedy no soslayó la posibilidad de explorar un acomodo con Cuba, no renunció en ningún instante a la política agresiva contra la isla. Realmente la invasión militar directa de tropas estadounidenses era poco recomendable en esos momentos, dado el posible costo de vidas estadounidenses, la repercusión negativa sobre los aliados y la opinión pública mundial, incluyendo la estadounidense. Además de que la isla había incrementado su capacidad defensiva y el frente interno contrarrevolucionario había sido considerablemente debilitado, pero no era una opción desechada a más largo alcance o como respuesta a algún acontecimiento inesperado que la legitimara tanto al interno de la isla como en el escenario internacional. La estrategia de Kennedy en relación con Cuba se centró entonces en jugar todas las cartas posibles que pudieran satisfacer los intereses estadounidenses. De esta manera se combinaban las acciones terroristas, las tácticas diplomáticas y la formación de un ejército mercenario para conformar un programa de múltiples vías que presionara al máximo a la isla, provocando una corrosión progresiva que llevara al régimen o bien a su derrocamiento o a negociar con Estados Unidos en función de sus intereses. Tengo que saltar porque el tiempo es brutal. El énfasis que la administración Kennedy puso en la política exterior de Cuba no fue más que la expresión coyuntural y la dimensión superficial de los motivos de fondo del conflicto. La historia demostró más tarde que cuando desaparecieron los argumentos que presentaban a Cuba como una amenaza a la seguridad nacional de Estados Unidos, especialmente luego de derrumbarse el campo socialista, el conflicto se mantuvo vivo y, por el contrario, el gobierno estadounidense endureció su posición contra Cuba, revelándose nuevamente la verdadera esencia del corte bilateral del conflicto: hegemonía versus soberanía. A la luz de hoy, esta experiencia de acercamiento secreto entre ambos países nos deja varias lecciones. 1. Incluso en los momentos más adversos y de mayor confrontación, es posible el acercamiento, el diálogo y la negociación, preferentemente utilizando los canales de la diplomacia secreta, siempre que exista voluntad política. 2. La extrema derecha siempre está al acecho de cualquier iniciativa que intente cambiar el curso de la política hostil hacia Cuba, para construir pretextos, crisis artificiales y desarrollar acciones violentas con el fin de torpedear la construcción de puentes entre ambos países. 3. Es necesario coraje y determinación y mucha inteligencia para romper los muros y saltar sobre los obstáculos que durante más de 6 décadas se han ido construyendo para eternizar una política de corte agresivo hacia la revolución cubana en la élite de poder de Estados Unidos. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Elier. Ok, entonces ya tenemos el PowerPoint funcionando, entonces retornamos al orden si no hay problema. Vamos entonces con el profesor Phillip Brenner. De American University, después vamos con Raúl de CCU, o sea, es el orden que está en el ahí. So, ok, la presentación. Ya.
Thank you very much to Ambassador Cabañas, to ISRI and CP, and Ernesto, thank you very much for giving me an extra half hour.
Yeah, no, I didn't.
So I want to pick up from what Elier just talked about, because William Faulkner was famous for having said, history is not only about the past facts, it's in fact not even past, it's about the present. And I want to talk to you about the way in which narratives shape and continue to shape U.S. policy. There are many explanations for the U.S. policy. There are particular factors. For example, Vice Minister Cosillo, I think, correctly points to the hegemonic, wrong one.
That's all.
Okay, Raúl, you want to talk?
They got it right the first time.
Does this count in his 12 minutes?
Yeah, of course. That's his penalty for bringing a PPT presentation.
Well, that's fine. I can.
Yeah.
There we go. Okay. Yeah.
Esa es la correcta.
So, one factor is the hegemonic interpretation that Vice Minister Cosillo alluded to, and that I talked about in a recent article called The Remarkable Durability of a Failed Embargo. The second factor, of course, is incompetence on the part of U.S. officials, and sometimes personal agendas by key officials, U.S. domestic politics. But one of the factors that I think is also important that shapes the way in which these particular factors emerge are the narratives that have dominated the U.S.-Cuban relationship and have led to the misperceptions on the part of U.S. officials. If you could go to the next slide, please. I was struck by this article in June that made reference to the so-called Chinese spy station and alluded to the Cuban Missile Crisis. It led me to think it's very important. This is why history continues with us, because the missile crisis, I think, still hangs over the relationship. And I want to highlight the way in which it's been misinterpreted. If you could go to the next slide, please. La próxima. So I'm not going to go through all the details. You can read this while I'm talking, but suffice to say that the U.S. general interpretation of the missile crisis is framed by 13 days that take place basically in Washington. There was a film made with Kevin Costner called 13 Days. Cuba is not even in the so-called Cuban Missile Crisis, the crisis that's called the October Crisis in Cuba. I think the correct time frame is the Cuban time frame, which is not 13 days, but 686 days, starting when President Eisenhower broke diplomatic relations with Cuba and began, and you could go back further to June when the United States cut off the sugar quota. The cause from the U.S. perspective of the crisis was Soviet aggression. But the reality was that the so-called crisis, the immediate crisis of putting in missiles, was due to a very active U.S. effort to overthrow the Cuban government. We have the documents that show that Operation Mongoose anticipated a U.S. invasion. Secretary of Defense McNamara, when he came had a meeting in Moscow with Cuban officials in 1989, said, if I were a Cuban official in 1962, I would have thought the United States was going to invade Cuba. Well, that does explain why Cuba accepted missiles. Reluctantly, I would note, but explains it. It's a very different story than Cuban aggression. And ultimately, the resolution of the crisis in the United States was interpreted as one where force is necessary to overcome your adversary. And that's what ended the conflict. And from the Cuban perspective, again, I think correctly, the conflict was avoided, but the sources were not resolved. And so the conflict continued. Very different interpretation, but from the U.S. perspective, Cuba was a threat. If we go to the next slide. A second incident, approximately. The second incident is the incident of the Soviet Brigade in 1979. So from the U.S. perspective, this was a combat brigade that the Soviets had now placed in Cuba and became a threat to the United States. From the U.S. perspective, it started in June of 1979 when an analyst first recognized this combat brigade. In fact, that brigade had been there since December 1962 and had been left there by the Soviets after the October crisis as a kind of tripwire to prevent the United States from actually invading Cuba. 3,000 troops, hardly an invasion force, but a junior analyst didn't understand what was taking place in a training exercise and labeled it as a combat brigade. That stayed in the intelligence community, and it was ultimately leaked to Senator Church in August of 1979, Senator Church, who had been to Cuba, had advocated better relations with Cuba, was now in a difficult political race, a Senate race for re-election in Idaho, and now felt he had to, for domestic political purposes, attack Cuba. So he leaked this intelligence report about a combat brigade. Robert Pastor, who was the National Security Advisor for Latin America, was on his honeymoon. And Brzezinski called the National Security Advisor. Brzezinski calls him back, and very little information to follow up on this. And immediately the president feels compelled to do something about it. By the end of September, he's issued PD 52, which is a national security document that declares that Cuba is a source of threat to the United States, and the United States must contain Cuba as a source of violent revolutionary change. So again, Cuba, major threat. Again, reminiscent somewhat of the missile crisis. We go now to the Chinese spy case. If you go to the next slide, please. Well, you know, I'm sure, very well aware of the headlines. China has a spy base. China is now, Cuba is now a source of threat because of this spy base. I have a video of the next, if we can go to the next slide. Let's just play 1 minute of this video, if we can, to give you a sense of the propaganda that was raised about this. Sound? Okay, well, there's no sound, but you can read the subtitles where an analyst is describing how this communication base is not only a threat to U.S. security, but is a source of a threat to U.S. Commerce, because what the Chinese are also doing is spying on companies to learn secrets, and it's part of a larger triangle. But this is key because Cuba is located in a key location that allows for this communication. The reality of this spy base, of course, is that these are sort of very old antennas. We can stop this video. Very old antennas that have been there for many years and are not manned, not staffed at all by Chinese. I mean, it's not, this isn't a base at all. But the China threat has now become part of the new, okay, we can go to the next slide, please. El Próximo. So all of a sudden, China has become the new threat. All right, you see this in papers put out by the think tanks, hearings in September in the House Foreign Affairs Committee. China is the new threat. Now, I mean, this is, in some sense, a repeat of the Cold War. But it's because the president himself sees the world in bipolar terms. And if the president sends out that signal that we see the world in bipolar terms, people below him are going to grab onto that for their own interest. So if you can go to the next slide. Next slide, please. Here's a speech just in October, 2 months ago, by the commander of the Southern Command. It's, of course, in her interest to have China as a threat because the Southern Command usually doesn't get very much money. It's the last place we spend money in the Defense Department. And so by raising the importance of the Chinese threat, there's the potential to put the Southern Command on the map for the president. And appeals to what the president sees as a new Cold War. The problem, of course, is that, as Fulton Amstrong has written in a very astute article in a recent book that Bill Leogrand and I had published, that the Chinese relationship with Cuba goes back many years. It wasn't very good, actually, in the old Cold War, but starting in the 1990s, it became very good. And at one point, China was Cuba's largest trading partner. That's diminished some, which is also to the point that China is not an increasing, doesn't have an increasing connection with Cuba. It's actually, to some extent, diminishing, but it goes back many years, and certainly it was true during the Obama administration when there was not a Cold War. Perceiving China as a threat is a construction that has no real basis in reality. And in fact, listening posts, we used to think, the United States used to think listening posts were a source of stability, that it's important for the other side to know what your capabilities are, what you're doing, so that they don't speculate about the worst, that they know the reality as a way of providing some kind of stability. So, bottom line here, Cuba, because it seeks support from China and Russia, normal to do that. Many countries have relations with China and Russia. But because Cuba is doing that, and continue with that continuing narrative that Cuba is a threat, Cuba now becomes part of the new Cold War, makes it more difficult for the president actually to see Cuba as Cuba. Cuba now becomes part of a nexus that is a threat to the United States, and it makes it much more difficult then for Cuba and the United States to have better relations. Thank you.
Gracias, Phil. Y sentimos por problemas técnicos, eso son cosas que suceden en esta clase de escenario. Entonces le damos la palabra a Raúl Rodriguez, el director del Centro de Estudios Hemisféricos y sobre Estados Unidos, de la Universidad de La Habana.
Buenos días. Gracias, por supuesto, al IRRI, al rector, y por la invitación, al CIPI por la organización de este evento. Es la 21ª ocasión. A riesgo de que se entienda el título como un trabalengua, voy a tratar de explicar por qué. Y es evidente que en las presentaciones anteriores ya hay elementos que se han expuesto. Lo que sí nos da la idea, viendo el recorrido histórico que ha hecho desde la presentación de Elier, lo que habló el profesor Fulton y Phil, que hay una continuidad significativa en todos estos 60 años. Elier, ¿cómo hizo que cambie? La próxima, por favor. Viendo al inicio, cuando hablamos de las expectativas, por supuesto, y tratando de crear el marco para muchas de estas discusiones, en la política hacia Cuba se generan muchas expectativas con la elección del actual presidente Biden. Esas expectativas estaban basadas en sus declaraciones de campaña, el punto de partida, que en enero de 2021 era una rápida, a la que Fulton hizo referencia, y gran deterioro de la relación bilateral durante Trump. El hecho de que Biden había sido el vicepresidente durante este periodo de los 6 años, del 6º año al 8º año de Obama, que parece, como también se dijo, que es un síntoma en este caso, y la designación de algunos miembros de su equipo, Blinken, Mallorca, en Homeland Security, que incluso había estado en las negociaciones con Cuba anteriormente, Zúñiga, Mendrala y otros y nombres que se señalaron. Esto daba una idea de que, una expectativa de que la política iba a ser diferente. Próximo, por favor. También, si tenemos en cuenta los factores que han sido no eran favorables, tenemos que tomar en cuenta estos factores. Durante la administración Trump se había generado una recomposición de la derecha cubanoamericana para obstaculizar los cambios positivos. La correlación de fuerza con que Biden llega a la Casa Blanca es frágil, o sea, una mayoría frágil en ambas cámaras, y desde el 2022 es solo en el Senado la mayoría. La correlación de fuerzas en América Latina y el Caribe era diferente al momento anterior, durante la administración Obama, cuando se hicieron los cambios más positivos. La proyección internacional de esta administración, que desde sus documentos, o sea, de sus declaraciones, comenzaba a hacer énfasis, y en eso concuerdo con lo que dice Phil, de la confrontación con China y Rusia, y esta promoción del llamado orden liberal internacional y el orden basado en reglas, las reglas que solo son para Estados Unidos y o sea, que son de Estados Unidos para que cumplan otros, no para que cumpla Estados Unidos. Próximo, por favor. La realidad, entonces, ¿cuál ha sido? Cuba se mantiene como un asunto asociado a intereses político-electorales más que un tema de política exterior. Prevalece la visión estrecha que bajo la lógica de cualquier ajuste de política tendría que considerar los costos políticos que tendrían que enfrentar frente a los representantes del electorado. No digo al electorado porque ya es evidente que Florida es un estado rojo, pero los representantes de ese electorado tienen ciertas posiciones importantes en el Congreso. Digo aquí especialmente Menéndez, aunque sabemos que el senador Menéndez está en una situación complicada, ya no es el jefe del comité, pero todavía es senador y no sabemos en qué va a parar eso, y otros representantes de la Florida. En la realidad se mantiene, como se ha dicho aquí también, el injerencismo en las cuestiones internas de Cuba. Se trata a Cuba como adversario, ya se ha dicho aquí. Se desconoce y se descalifica al gobierno de Cuba como Estado fallido y se asume una posición parcializada en su contra. La retórica en general de la administración es difusa, engañosa y dibuja una intención humanitaria que no concreta. La próxima, por favor. La próxima. Como ya se dijo aquí anteriormente, en las palabras del viceministro y en otras presentaciones, se mantiene el sistema de medidas coercitivas unilaterales que incluso en la pandemia se mantuvieron siguiendo la tendencia, aunque pudiéramos decir que el ritmo es más lento y hay menor estridencia en el anuncio, pero en la práctica se mantienen. Se mantiene el apoyo financiero y político a los intentos de subvertir el orden político a Cuba. Se hacen esfuerzos diplomáticos para lograr condena y oposición al gobierno de Cuba internacionalmente. Aquí se hizo referencia a la oposición y todo lo que se hizo para intentar que Cuba no ganara, no tuviera el puesto en la Comisión de Derechos Humanos, los intentos de descrédito del internacionalismo medio cubano. Se mantiene la aplicación del título 3 de la Helms-Burton, aunque podríamos decir que ya el mal está hecho. La caja de Pandora está abierta, hay 40 y tantos procesos andando que no se van pero bueno, pudiera como gesto político revertirse al menos y instalarse la prohibición, y no se hace. Y el mantenimiento de Cuba como Estado patrocinador del terrorismo, se hizo referencia aquí al informe, el último informe, a todos los detalles, a pesar de todas las posiciones contrarias expresadas por gobiernos latinoamericanos y todo lo que se ha hablado aquí. No solo el gobierno de Colombia, el gobierno de México, el gobierno de Chile, muchísimos jefes de Estado, muchísimas instancias. Al parecer no hay la voluntad de escuchar esas opiniones y esa comunidad internacional no tiene capacidad de influir en esto, como ya se ha explicado aquí anteriormente. La próxima. Aquí podemos hacer una pregunta que ya también ha sido respondida, ¿no? O sea, ¿es que esta administración queda atrapada en el entramado de medidas coercitivas unilaterales que existen o hay falta de voluntad política? Está claro. Por ejemplo, si tomamos en el anuncio del 20 existe, esto es tomado literalmente de los anuncios del año 2022 que se hablaron de una flexibilización de la política hacia Cuba. Se habla del incremento al apoyo de los emprendedores cubanos independientes, y esto es lo que dice. Sin embargo, todos podemos leer, ¿no? Las oportunidades comerciales, fuera del sector estatal, autorizando el acceso a tecnologías, bla, bla, bla. Sin embargo, se mantienen hoy más de 60 sitios con acceso restringido para Cuba. Y esto está de acuerdo con esa fuente. Que se analizan alternativas para que se amplíen el apoyo a los pagos de actividades de Internet y pagos electrónicos y negocios a emprendedores cubanos independientes. Hasta los últimos días, la OFAC mantiene y aplica altas penalidades a entidades financieras por transacciones que involucren a Cuba. Y esto es como una gran espada de Damocles que se mantiene con gran fuerza. Y lo otro, nos proponemos trabajar para ampliar el acceso a los emprendedores de microfinanzas y la capacitación. Quizás la capacitación, si entendemos que han invitado a algunas personas aquí a la Embajada de Estados Unidos a dar talleres a los emprendedores cubanos, bueno, eso quizás pudiera ser algo que sí se ha cumplido. Adelante, la próxima. Entonces, después de 15 meses se anunció esa política que decimos. Sí, es real, se ha aumentado el personal en la Embajada de Estados Unidos, el procesamiento de algunas categorías de visas seleccionadas, la autorización de vuelos a otras provincias más allá de La Habana, la modificación del límite de las remesas, diálogo en aspectos de interés para Estados Unidos, y así se explica, se dice claramente, diálogo en lo que nos interesa, o sea, en el que interesa a Estados Unidos, según se han retomado las conversaciones migratorias y se ha mantenido la cooperación en seguridad, sobre todo entre los servicios de guardacosta y guardafronteras, como ya se decía aquí, y otros aspectos de cumplimiento de la ley. Adelante. La próxima. Las realidades, entonces, nos dicen que la respuesta de Cuba ha sido disposición a la colaboración, al diálogo en todo lo bilateral. Es el interés nacional de Cuba, sobre todo en términos de la migración, las relaciones económicas internacionales, porque ya se ha explicado aquí el obstáculo fundamental que representa el sistema tan abarcador y completo de medidas coercitivas unilaterales que se ha sometido a Cuba, no solo desde 2017, sino desde que se instauró este bloqueo. La respuesta de Estados Unidos: contactos en aspectos de interés para Estados Unidos, silencio en otros y evasiva a discutir a profundidad otros, como el caso del aspecto migratorio. Es evidente que la política sigue siendo cambio de régimen, que es la política de Estado. Adelante. Próximo. En nuestra opinión, aquí lo que se aprecia es un cálculo político. Es que en gran parte del liderazgo del gobierno de Estados Unidos existe una idea de la percepción de la situación cubana, que hay una transición de un liderazgo histórico que implica, según ellos, menos legitimidad y debilitamiento de un consenso interno, que hay un agravamiento de la situación económica generada por el efecto de las medidas de máxima presión y el impacto de la pandemia, y que las reformas económicas en Cuba tienen un impacto social. Entonces no es el momento adecuado para promover otro tipo de política que no sea el mantenimiento de la presión y el mantenimiento de este nivel de confrontación. La próxima. Próxima. Si tenemos en cuenta la política exterior en general de la administración Biden, que está orientada a afianzar el status quo y las bases de la proyección imperial, a reencaminar la disputa de política por el liderazgo mundial con los objetivos hegemónicos de Estados Unidos, el objetivo de sostener al país como primera potencia mundial, que es también su política de Estado, la presentación de esta binaria de democracias versus autocracias, que es a conveniencia, y el uso de sanciones económicas como instrumento de poder. La próxima. Y con esta idea de multilateralismo y democracia y diplomacia, no como aceptación de estar entre iguales, sino como un mecanismo para reducir la tensión de los recursos materiales humanos de Estados Unidos, siempre con la perspectiva del liderazgo estadounidense. Si tomamos todo eso en cuenta, la próxima, llegaríamos a entonces cuáles son las expectativas para 2024. Y aquí, siendo un año de elecciones, lo que más nos podemos concluir que tendremos continuidad e inmovilismo de parte del gobierno de Biden, no grandes expectativas, y más de 2024 es imposible predecir otra cosa que quizás sea una posible revancha entre el Donald Trump y Joe Biden. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Raúl, y sobre todo gracias también, además de por el contenido, por ajustarte al tiempo. Entonces, para cerrar, last but not least, le damos la palabra a Richard Feinberg, que nos va a hacer una presentación que él les dirá exactamente de qué es ahora.
Thanks very much for this opportunity. It's an honor to be here with CPE, ISRE, once again on a panel with such distinguished colleagues. As I think you know, I'm here as a pinch hitter, that the Honorable William Leo Grande was supposed to make this presentation, but he took ill last night. I gather he is doing better today. Hopefully he'll be with us tomorrow. I'm going to do my best under these circumstances. I think I'll do something a little bit different. One thing, I believe countries make their own history. Yes, we're all inserted in a certain sort of geopolitical, historical moment, but nevertheless, countries do make choices. And it's not just about what other countries are doing, it's the choices that each country itself makes. Under certain constraints, of course. We all face constraints. The United States doesn't do whatever it wants. I worked at the Treasury Department for a while. It wasn't as though we could set the dollar at any rate we wanted. It wasn't as though we could set our interest rates. We had to take into account global markets. We had to take into account the way other countries would react to whatever we did. So even in an area as important as international finance, the United States doesn't just do whatever it wants. It has to take into account the international environment, and in that context, tries to maximize its own interest. So what I thought I would do here today, something a little different, maybe a little bit along the lines of what Fulton Amstrong did, is look at current U.S. priorities, domestic and international priorities, and look at how Cuba might fit in to those international priorities. And if you listen to what people in the Biden administration are saying, what are their current priorities? Their current priorities are climate change, immigration, global value chains, and geopolitical competition. Okay? So let me take each of those briefly, how I think the Biden administration is looking at those issues and how Cuba does or might fit in. Let me just also mention that U.S. policy in general works at three levels: multilateral, United Nations, World Bank, etc., plurilateral, that is to say with coalitions of countries that are interested in working with the United States on common goals and objectives, and then, of course, ultimately bilateral. And the U.S. chooses, sometimes it works on all three levels at the same time on an issue, or sometimes it will choose one of those three where it thinks it can make the most progress at any given time. I think to try to understand how the U.S. makes these choices, put yourselves in the shoes of a national security advisor, of Jake Sullivan. He only has about 20 hours a day of work, all right? His list of possible to-dos is endless. How is he going to decide which of all those many issues to tackle in his 20 hours a day? Well, immediately if he sees some issues, I just can't make progress. Other countries aren't interested. They'll just complain or whatever, or I don't have the time. So I'll cross those 8 issues off. And now I'm beginning to look at a set of issues where I might be able to make a little difference today and move things forward a little further, okay? That's practically how somebody at that level tries to organize their day, okay? So, a country like Cuba has to make a decision. Does it want to be in that top list of 12 issues or so where Cuba is included as a country with which the United States could work and make some progress either at the multilateral, plurilateral, or bilateral level? So if we start with climate change, right now COP28 is meeting. I have to say, I find this so amusing. How is it possible that they're meeting in the Gulf states to talk about reducing carbon emissions? To me, this is so shockingly, glaringly contradictory in its imagery that I just, can't quite wrap my arms around it. But anyway, that's what they're doing. Now, obviously, Cuba, particularly as an island, with many beaches and confronting all sorts of hurricanes and other forms of climate violence already, the issue of climate change, and I don't need to tell Cubans this, is of vital importance to Cuba. absolutely strategic, vital importance. Nothing more important for Cuba than the issue of climate change. Now, there the United States has a number of initiatives specifically oriented towards the Caribbean. At the Los Angeles Summit of the Americas, Kamala Harris, the Vice President, met with leaders from around mostly the CARICOM countries and the Dominican Republic, and they put together a certain initiative called 2030, Climate Change in the Caribbean for 2030. And they are putting together certain plans with some monies behind them. Well, we'll see. There are lots of plans out there that never go anywhere. But this does have some official high-level attention. They are monitoring it. There will be annual reports. That's the sort of very specific climate change initiative that would be of interest to any island in the Caribbean. Then, of course, the issue of alternative energy, wind, solar, obviously a tremendous opportunity for Cuba. You've already begun that. Related to that is more efficient use of hydrocarbons in a more decentralized manner. I know Cuba has already done some of that, but there are a lot of programs out there now to accelerate transition to those renewables with financing. And some of this financing, Cubans are already eligible if it comes through the United Nations, but some of the financing comes through the World Bank, CAF, Inter-American Development Bank, and other sources that Cuba is not currently eligible for, but could be in a certain different environment. So that's something to keep one eye on. Okay, so climate change. Immigration. There's no bigger issue in Cuba today than the issue of immigration. It's the major political vulnerability of Biden going into the 2024 campaign. The Democrats are rather in a panic about it. The media doesn't help. It sensationalizes whatever is or isn't happening at the border, and the Republicans want to make it a major issue, arguing that the United States does not control its borders and it's the fault of Democrats. So how does Cuba play into that discussion? We'll see. There are a lot of Cuban migrants, of course, now entering the United States. Will that be seen as a vulnerability for Biden? At the Los Angeles Summit of the Americas also, there was an accord, the Los Angeles Accord on Migration, in general signed by most, not all, of the other Latin American and Caribbean countries. Didn't solve all problems, but it was a start in looking at migration as an issue, not just as a threat, but as an issue that all countries have to sit around the table and try to work on in terms of mutual interests. Not just how do you stop it, but how do you organize it, how do you settle migrants in a more humane way, a set of values and principles that I think, I'm sure officials in the Cuban ministry are well aware of that accord. I think at some point, being part of an accord like that probably would be of interest to Cuba. And that accord was really just a first step in trying to organize a hemispheric-wide or a Caribbean basin-wide, more organized approach to immigration. Because after all, immigration is not something that's going to disappear. The demographic forces are very strong and they will continue. Another major issue for the administration is global value chains. The idea to move some of the production out of China, not all of it, but some of it out of China, to nearshoring, that is to say, to the Caribbean basin. Most of that would be Mexico, but some of it will also be to the Caribbean and Central America. Now, obviously that's not feasible under current circumstances, but one could imagine Mariel, even Guantanamo at some point, becoming areas where factories could be part of global value chains, some of which could be linked to Mexico, in which factories are in Mexico. Cuba produces certain components that are then shipped to Mexico, and then the final product shipped all around the region. That does, and I can only talk about this briefly, raise the whole issue of ESGs, or environmental, social, governance, that is to say, workers' rights. And the Biden administration is very strong on the issue of workers' rights at production facilities. So the extent to which global value chains operating in the Caribbean basin were living up to certain basic internationally recognized labor standards, and there was adequate monitoring and transparency of these worker and environmental standards, that would give the region actually a leg up on competitor regions such as Southeast Asia that also want to very much gain from the movement of global value chains out of China, but have lower wages, but perhaps not as good conditions for workers and environmental protection. So if you had good ESG standards here, that might give you a leg up. So that's something which, of course, Cuba, and certainly in terms of your values and your constitution, would be completely in agreement with. So I hear that my time is running out. I could go on to talk about a few other issues. Fulton already went through a lot of the issues having to do with the control of the illegal movements of goods, illicit goods and peoples. There already are a lot of agreements based upon mutual interests between the United States and Cuba. On the very difficult issue, and I guess my time is out, to talk about strategic competition and Russia, China in the Western Hemisphere. That would be a separate, an entirely separate lecture. But let me just say one provocative thing. One could imagine a dialogue between the United States and Cuba, the goal of which would be to just have some sort of general understanding about how each country saw its interests, perhaps with the idea of establishing certain understandings of what each country would see as tripwires or as activities that would be counter to their national interests. The U.S. does have dialogues of that sort with many countries around the world, so this would not be innovative in a diplomatic sense, but it certainly would be innovative, of course, in terms of U.S.-Cuba relations. So I'm told my time is up. But as I suggest, I think there's a very rich agenda here. I've laid out what are the priorities of the Biden administration that cover both international affairs, and almost all these issues also have a strong domestic component, and that can be operated at a multilateral, plurilateral, or bilateral level. So thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Richard. El panel, como ustedes pueden ver, nos ha presentado con los distintos factores que condicionan la conformación de esa política de Estados Unidos hacia Cuba, desde factores históricos de alcance estructural hasta los aspectos que entran en las prioridades de política de cada uno de los dos estados, por supuesto, los aspectos pragmáticos del proceso mismo y otros factores y variables que inciden en el tema, así como las políticas, algunas de las características concretas de esa política. Estos son temas que, por supuesto, es lo que vamos en realidad a estar discutiendo de una manera u otra a lo largo del resto de este evento, de esta conferencia, pero lamentablemente no podemos hacerlo ahora mismo porque por constricciones de tiempo no tenemos el espacio para tener una sesión de debate, lamentablemente, de acuerdo con lo que me informan los organizadores, por la hora que habíamos dicho desde el principio. Entonces, les pido a todos que las preguntas y dudas que tengan las vayan insertando, ¿no?, en los próximos paneles en la medida de lo posible, y por supuesto si los panelistas generosamente están de acuerdo con sostener conversaciones de pasillo o en otro momento, entonces mejor todavía. Muchísimas gracias a todos y bueno, entonces vamos a la pausa que estaba prevista antes y regresamos a las 12 en punto para el siguiente panel. Gracias.